A stick drifts across the surface of the Chicago River, until suddenly it slides upstream, moving against the current, as if the water itself obeys fear. It looks impossible, but this isn't wind or illusion. You're watching a river forced to run backward by human hands. Chicago didn't do this for glory. They did it because the city was drinking its own sewage. Typhoid was tearing through neighborhoods. The water tasted like rot. People said you could smell the river before you could see it. So just after midnight on January 2nd, 1900, under clouded winter darkness, they broke open the temporary dam holding back the sanitary and ship canal. Water surged south toward the Mississippi for the first time in living memory, opened hours before any injunction could be filed. But to understand why Chicago believed this midnight move was their only option, you need to see the life-or-death gamble they were trapped inside. A desperate city survived, but in the process, they awakened a slow-moving disaster that hasn't stopped advancing. Chicago in the 1890s looked unstoppable. Steel skyscrapers rising, railroads firing in every direction, a booming population filling every street. But beneath all that confidence was a river locals openly called the Stinking River, a slow, dark cesspool choking on sewage, factory runoff, and slaughterhouse waste. Every rainfall flushed the city's filth straight into the Chicago River, which flowed directly into Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan was the city's drinking water. People living near the river kept their windows shut year-round. Not even summer heat could convince them to open them. If you worked near the Union stockyards, the smell clung to your clothes for days. The worst place of all was Bubbly Creek, a tributary so overloaded with blood, fat, and decomposing animal parts that the surface literally bubbled like boiling tar. By the early 1890s, waterborne diseases, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, were killing thousands every year. Entire neighborhoods tracked death tolls the way other cities tracked weather. Some mornings, families would turn on their taps and watch brown water spill out, arguing whether boiling it would make it safer or just smell worse. And then came the red flag. When contamination levels spiked, the city would raise a warning flag over its offshore intake cribs, a literal signal telling residents, the tap is poisoned today. But eventually, people stopped reacting. When danger becomes daily, it becomes normal. Then, in July of 1885, nature delivered a wake-up call no one could ignore. A record-breaking rainstorm flushed so much sewage into the lake that the drinking water turned visibly brown citywide. For the first time, panic hit every social class at once, and lawmakers finally realized Chicago was one storm away from a citywide catastrophe. Engineers tried pushing drinking water intakes farther out, 2 miles offshore, then 4, but the sewage followed every time. And Chicago's population was still exploding. Every new resident meant more waste pouring into the same doomed river. Here's a question for you. Answer in the comments. If your city warned you that the tap water was contaminated, would you leave? Or would you stay because your whole life is rooted there? By the late 1890s, one idea began to emerge. Massive, wild, and almost unbelievable. If the river was killing the city, then Chicago would force the river to run the other way. Chicago's leaders finally accepted a brutal truth. They could not clean the river fast enough to save the city. So the sanitary district's chief engineer, Isham Randolph, stepped forward with a plan that sounded less like infrastructure and more like a violation of natural law. What if they carved a new channel, bigger, deeper, stronger, and connected Chicago directly to the Mississippi watershed? A channel so precisely sloped that Lake Michigan water would begin flowing away from the lake, all by gravity. Most politicians laughed. Newspapers mocked it as lunacy with a price tag. But Randolph and his engineers kept pointing to the same detail on every map. Chicago sits on the edge of a subcontinental divide. To the east, water flows to the Atlantic. To the west, to the Gulf of Mexico. And the barrier between them wasn't a mountain. It was a low, marshy ridge, in some places barely a few feet high. Nature had left a back door unlocked. Chicago decided to kick it open. But kicking it open wouldn't be gentle. The ridge wasn't just mud. It was a sheet of prehistoric dolomite limestone, hard as iron. Breaking through it would require a synchronized assault of steam shovels, steel drills, and dynamite that would shake the city for years. The engineering challenge was unprecedented. Carved 28 miles through glacial drift and solid stone, the largest excavation project ever attempted in North America. Some cuts would drop over 30 feet into bedrock, deep enough to swallow a 3-story building. To understand the scale, in 1900, this kind of earth moving didn't exist yet. This trench became the training ground for the 20th century. The steam shovels and excavation techniques perfected here were later shipped to Central America to dig the Panama Canal. Chicago wasn't just saving itself, it was building the prototype for modern mega-engineering. And as panic spread downstream and political pressure mounted, Chicago's engineers made their choice. They would build the canal faster than anyone could stop them. Cutting through that ridge wasn't just difficult. It was warfare against the earth itself. The crews weren't facing dirt. They were facing a prehistoric wall of dolomite limestone, so hard it rang like a church bell when struck with a hammer. To break it, engineers invented a new choreography of destruction. Drill teams boring holes, dynamite crews wiring charges through the stone, and steam shovels waiting like metal predators for the blast to clear. And the sky didn't tear open. It echoed with blasts, day after day, year after year. But the steam shovels weren't even the real monsters. This project gave birth to machines that looked like alien technology. Cantilever hoists, giant steel bridges mounted on wheels, rolled across the trench, lifting whole boulders into the air and flinging them aside as if they were nothing. And the rock had to go somewhere. They didn't just dig a canal, they created a mountain range. The spoil banks rose so high they blocked the horizon, a man-made spine of blasted stone visible for miles. Towns complained that daylight looked dimmer. Standing near the trench felt like walking inside a scar the earth never intended to reveal. The work was brutal, deadly. In 1893, the quarrymen, the men who drilled and blasted the stone face, went on strike after yet another fatal accident. Their walkout froze construction and forced the sanitary district to negotiate, revealing just how dangerous this engineering marvel really was. Yet the innovations born here would echo far beyond Chicago. The excavation methods and heavy machinery refined in this trench would later be exported to Central America, becoming the backbone of the Panama Canal project. By 1899, the big ditch was finished. The blasting stopped. Silence returned. And then the telegraph clicked. St. Louis had filed their lawsuit. The Supreme Court was stepping in. Digging the canal was the easy part. Now they had to fill it. Would you have dared to work in a place the men themselves called hell? For 7 brutal years, Chicago had blasted, shoveled, and sacrificed its way toward an engineering dream no city had ever attempted, to force a river to run the wrong way. And by the winter of 1900, everything was ready. The trench carved, the gates built, the slopes set. But the city wasn't just fighting nature. It was fighting fear. Downstream, St. Louis warned that Chicago wasn't purifying anything. They accused the city of building a 28-mile sewage launcher aimed straight at Missouri. And as the canal neared completion, the political tension became electric. Telegraph chatter hinted that Missouri's lawyers were preparing injunctions. Newspapers speculated that federal officials were watching closely. Local and downstate political pressure added its own heat. But the truth remained. No lawsuit had been filed yet. Only whispered rumors and the urgency of telegraph lines hinting that federal action might soon follow. Though no lawsuit existed, the threat felt real enough to spur a bold, irreversible move. Rumors, pressure, politics, and the fear that hesitation might give Washington time to intervene. So Chicago acted first. Long before the morning ceremony, a small crew moved quietly through the frozen darkness. No speeches, no ceremony, not even full crews, just men wrapped in heavy coats, their boots crunching across ice. Their frost-thickened breath drifted into the night. Lanterns flickered against the limestone walls, throwing long, trembling shadows across a canal carved by thousands of exhausted workers. The night was quiet but for the faint, rhythmic clinking of tools and the breath of men carving history in frostbitten silence. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't illegal. The sanitary district was fully empowered by Illinois law. But it was urgent, tense, and almost clandestine in its timing. At 11:06 p.m. on January 2nd, 1900, the final temporary dam was pulled free. For a heartbeat, as if nature itself held its breath, the water hung still. Then a thunderous roar shattered the stillness as the river surged forward, rushing into the canal's artificial drop. And in that moment, the impossible happened. The Chicago River reversed direction. On this night hung the health of millions, the future of the city, and Chicago's very survival. Chicago had won this moment, but the victory was only temporary, because 6 years later, Missouri would file the lawsuit that dragged both states all the way to the Supreme Court. The war over the river's destiny was only beginning. At sunrise on January 3rd, 1900, Chicago celebrated. The river had reversed. The canal was open. And after decades of deadly outbreaks, millions finally believed their drinking water might be safe. But downstream, St. Louis saw something very different. Telegraphs crackled with the news. Chicago had opened the canal early, quietly, urgently, without warning. To Missouri, this was an engineering triumph. It was a 28-mile conduit poised to carry Chicago's sewage straight into their watershed. Within days, newspapers erupted. St. Louis in danger. Pollution racing down the Mississippi. Chicago claimed the reversal would save lives. St. Louis claimed it would endanger theirs. The science was unsettled. Chicago's experts argued microbes couldn't survive a long journey south. A contested theory, not a certainty. Missouri's doctors countered with early signs of worsening water quality. And though the pollution itself would take years to spread downstream, the fear arrived instantly. Downriver communities soon reported foul odors, fish die-offs, and worries about contaminated wells. Some farmers testified their livestock sickened after drinking river water. The conflict wasn't philosophical. It was unfolding in real towns along the Illinois River. By 1906, 6 years after the reversal, Missouri finally filed suit. The legal war stretched across decades, hitting the Supreme Court multiple times. The rulings were narrow, technical, and often frustrating. But Chicago survived, legally, politically, barely. And while lawyers argued, the river system itself was undergoing a more profound transformation. By carving the canal, Chicago had erased the continental divide, permanently linking the Great Lakes and Mississippi basins. A new biological corridor was born. Pollution could move, organisms could move, and eventually, invaders could move. In the 1970s, one arrived, Asian carp. Fast-breeding, muscle-strong, and ecologically relentless, they surged northward. By the 2000s, they were pressing toward Lake Michigan, threatening a $7 billion Great Lakes ecosystem. To stop them, engineers built a shimmering electric barrier, a multi-layered field designed to stun invasive fish before they reach the lake. The paradox is stark. Chicago reversed the river to escape disease, and now electrifies it to escape fish. In bending nature, Chicago reshaped the region's waters, ecosystems, and the laws that govern them, forever. The story didn't end when Chicago turned a river around. If anything, it revealed a deeper truth, one the region is still wrestling with. Through the late 20th century, new environmental laws, upgraded treatment plants, and massive cleanup projects slowly restored water quality. Real change didn't come quickly. It took the Clean Water Act of the 1970s, industrial crackdowns, and billions in remediation before the river even began to heal. And even today, combined sewer overflows and industrial spills remain a threat, including the major asphalt spill cleanup, still underway in 2025. The canal is cleaner than ever, yes, but never safe from backsliding. Meanwhile, the canal itself remained what it became in 1900, a biological superhighway no one could close. Invasive species continue probing its edges. Every drought, every record-breaking storm, every ecological surprise tests a system built for a calmer, more predictable century. Heavy rains overwhelm sewers. Droughts weaken the downstream pull. Climate extremes push the engineered river toward its limits. And the political battles never faded. Great Lakes states challenge diversions. Missouri still contests environmental risk. Tribes, river towns, and cities file objections, arguing over the same question raised in 1900. When one city bends nature to survive, who pays the price downstream? More than a century later, the electric barriers still hum, holding back consequences by a margin thinner than anyone wants to admit. The river flows backward, but the effects flow forward, into policy, ecology, and every community tied to its water. Chicago changed a river to save itself. Now the river changes us, forcing new science, new politics, and new humility. Because nature remembers what we forget. Nothing we change stays changed for free.